My name's Alex Edmans. I'm a Professor of Finance at London Business School, and I specialise in responsible business and corporate governance. And I really appreciate the Global Ethical Finance Initiative giving me the opportunity to speak. So what I'm going to speak about today is there a business case for diversity? And you might think, well, am I seriously asking this question? Right? Because hasn't this question already been answered conclusively many times? So there's various McKinsey reports, and the most recent one, called Diversity Wins, concludes that the business case for gender and ethnic diversity in top teams is stronger than ever. And there's a recent study commissioned by the Financial Reporting Council, which interviewed some chairs, and one of them says, there have been enough reports and statistics and evidence-based research to stop talking about it and get on with it. And another chair talked about who he looks for in terms of board suggestions from executive search firms. I don't want to see any men. I don't care if they're Jesus Christ. I don't want to see them. And these are things that absolutely I'm predisposed to believe as an ethnic minority, as in a strong support of responsibility and diversity more generally. I would like this to be unambiguous. But then I saw some new research which was really inconvenient. And so this is how it proceeded. A new study has found a strong negative relationship between gender diversity and shareholder value. Over the last 20 years, the percentage of women on FTSE 100 boards has improved by 26% versus 15% for the S&P 500. But in terms of total shareholder returns, for the FTSE 100, it's gone up by only 136, but for the S&P 500, it's gone up by 221%. Commenting on the findings, the lead researcher said, this is the clearest evidence yet that having more women on boards destroys shareholder value. Each additional 10% of female representation costs 75% in shareholder returns. If the UK had gender parity, this would reduce the market value by a cumulative 2.3 trillion pounds. So the whole idea here is that in the UK, gender diversity has gone up by more than the US, and that's why the stock market has done worse. Now, when you read something like that, you get immediately angry. You think this is an offensive study. You try to poke all the holes in it, and there's lots of holes you can poke in this. But there could be so many other reasons for why the US stock market has done well. Nothing to do with gender diversity, so this is really unreliable. But all I'll say is, yes, this is indeed an unreliable study, but the same skepticism that we apply to a study that we don't like, we should also apply to the studies that we do like. Why? Because I will say that unfortunately, many of the studies which are taken for granted as proving the business case for diversity have just as fundamental flaws as this study. So some of you might know that I gave a TED talk a few years ago on confirmation bias, and this is the idea that when we see something we don't like, the part of the brain that lights up is the amygdala, and that's the same part of the brain that lights up when we're attacked by a tiger. So we often respond to evidence in an emotional fight or flight response. If we don't like the evidence, we're immediately defensive. If we like it, we latch onto this. And so we need to be really careful about an issue like diversity, which is important to all of us. It's personally important to me as a minority, but it's important to everybody who cares about responsibility, regardless of your status. But this does mean, because our opinions on this are strong, that we need to tread carefully with the data. And let me just go through one example of one study, just to show you how careful we need to be. And I'm going to choose the recent study commissioned by the Financial Reporting Council. Why? It's the most recent one. It was commissioned by a UK regulator, which does have a history of being really evidence-based. It will always try to make sure that anything it passes is based on research, and therefore commissioned institutions to do the research for them. And one of them was, unfortunately for me, London Business School, some of my colleagues, and it gives me great pain that this study is actually quite flimsy. But my goal as a researcher is to be led only by the science, regardless of who does it, whether it's my colleague or somebody who I dislike for some reason. I need to apply the same standards. And unfortunately here, this is an example of a study with very weak findings. So what it claims is the following. higher levels of gender diversity positively correlate with better future performance as measured by the EBITDA margin. And not only is that a correlation, but this is also causation. Indeed, they contrast it with prior research. Prior decades, research for decades, hasn't confirmed anything causal. And then they write in bold, these results suggest that gender diverse boards are more effective than those without women. Then the Dean of London Business School writes a foreword saying the academic rigor with which data was collected yields new insights. We all stand to learn from the author's methodology and findings. So not only are the results strong, the results are also particularly well done and rigorous. And indeed, the Leadership Institute, which did the research, said at the foreword, we treated it with the rigor and care of our best scholarly research. And not surprisingly, with such strong findings, which people would like to be true, with such rigor of London Business School, this has led to many people reporting on the study, taking it at face value. And it's not their fault for taking it at face value. The study is over 100 pages. You can't expect everybody to read every single word, so they went with the executive summary. Minerva Analytics, a great research organization, wrote an article, Boardroom Diversity Improves Financial Performance. The Institute for Chartered Accountants of England and Wales wrote an article, The First Line, the case for diverse boards was given further clout after new research published by the FRC. Linklaters, a great law firm I've worked with previously, found that the effort to diversify boards pays benefits in terms of culture and performance. Okay, but all of these statements were made without actually looking at the data. So let's look at what the data actually found. So this is their own claim from the executive summary. Higher levels of gender diversity lead to better financial performance. What is their measure of financial performance? EBITDA margin. One might wonder whether that's actually the good measure. You can improve margins by cutting costs, but let's stand in their corner and use their measure, and let's look at their results. So they did 90 different analyses trying to find a relationship, 6 measures of diversity, over 5 different years of future performance, 3 different sets of firms, so 6 times 5 times 3, 90 different attempts. None of them worked. Not a single one of those regressions were significant, but they wrote in a report for the regulator that this was a positive relationship. And then they had another statement in bold, these results suggest that gender diverse boards are more effective than those without women. Now they actually had 2 measures of effectiveness. They had not just the EBITDA margin, but they also had total shareholder return. And they conducted 180 tests, of which only 7 were significant out of 180, and 2 were significant in the wrong direction. So basically, they found nothing at all, yet made these very bold claims. And even their results on shareholder returns were wrong because they make a basic error. They just look at capital gains, they ignore dividends, and dividends are a really important part of the return to shareholders. So this shows that we can't take research at face value. So these people were claiming stuff which was not at all supported by the data. And unfortunately, the problem was deeper than just this one study. So what do we want to do in order to look at academic research in general? We don't just do one study, but we look at the research of many studies published in all of the top journals. And this has been done by at least 3 really top scholars. And importantly, if you are somebody who does research in these top journals, you're able to discern the careful research from those which might be less careful. Catherine Klein, who's the Vice Dean of Social Impact at Wharton, where I used to teach, says that research conducted by consulting firms is not as rigorous as peer-reviewed research. The study I just mentioned was not peer-reviewed. That's why they could get away with those statements. Here I dig into the rigorous peer-reviewed studies. Spoiler alert, there is no improvement in performance by having greater diversity. Jesse Fried of Harvard, he looked at the NASDAQ rule, which argues that we need to force minorities to be on the board. And he says, no, rigorous scholarship, much of it by leading female economists, suggests that increasing diversity actually worsens performance. And then Alice Eagley, a psychology professor at Northwestern, asked, well, if the research is so ambiguous, Why is it presented at black and white? Well, there's an obvious appeal in simple claims that diversity improves performance. And this is why you have practitioners and consultants claiming this, and this is why they often will use this in marketing materials. So the rigorous research, if you look at any scholar who's looked at the research in general, this does not show a benefit of diversity. Or does it? Right? Because what I was asked to speak about by Geffy was the business case for diversity. But what is diversity truly? Well, the Financial Conduct Authority in the recent consultation says diversity of thought or cognitive diversity. They refer to different perspectives, abilities, knowledge, attitudes, information styles, and demographic characteristics. But all of the studies that I focused on, they looked at demographic characteristics like ethnicity and gender. And indeed, the FCA itself, while it starts with this, it then presents all of the evidence on demographic characteristics, handpicking a few studies that act in the direction that they want. But that is not true diversity. So even if there is no relationship between demographic characteristics and firm performance, maybe all of these other things do work, do matter, but it's just people have not got data on them. And people care about not diversity, but diversity and inclusion. But this is something that you might actually be able to conduct studies about. And this is something that I did myself about 15 years ago. So I looked at the list of the 100 best companies to work for in America. And this is a list which will survey employees at all levels and ask them questions on how it is to work at the company. Credibility, fairness, respect, pride, and camaraderie. And clearly some of these things are not directly related to diversity and inclusion, but some of them are. But you might think if you have a diverse and inclusive culture, yes, you will show greater camaraderie, there will be fairness and there will be respect. So these things are linked to each other. And so what I found was that these companies, which were treating their employees well, which would likely involve D&I, were beating their peers in total shareholder return by 2.3 to 3.8% per year over a 28-year period, which is 89 to 184% cumulative. So there is a business case for treating employees well. It's just that that involves far more than just putting a few token minorities on the board to tick a box. Well, it could be that a company does not care at all about how it treats its employees, but just puts a few people on the board to tick a box. It's much harder to create a culture where everybody feels psychologically safe at work, they're able to speak up, they're able to contribute, they feel that their opinions are valued, and that is what's linking to higher performance. Now you might think, well, that's a study that was published 10 years ago. Is this still relevant today? Because there's so much focus on D&I now, maybe as an investor, there's no point investing on D&I because everybody knows it's important, they're going to take it into account and the returns would have gone away. But interestingly, this study was recently replicated. The replication only came out last week, where not only did they find that the results continue to hold in my time period, but it also still holds until 2020. So in the 10 years since I finished the study, the results are still there. And that might seem shocking. Like, doesn't everybody know that treating employees well matters right now? Shouldn't this already be in the stock price? There should be no investment value of this. But it's linked to the first part of my talk. Right, so the first part of my talk suggested that actually the simple measures of diversity, looking at females or ethnic minorities on the board, doesn't actually capture true D&I. But there are many investors, and there's many others, who will just evaluate the company based on these simple, superficial box-ticking metrics. True diversity inclusion, truly being a great place to work, that is something which is not in the stock price because many people don't actually bother to try to analyze this and gather the data on that. So overall, I would say there is a business case for diversity and inclusion. Well, at the start of my talk, when I presented the negative evidence, you might have thought, why did Geffy invite me here? You might have indeed even switched off your Zoom. But actually, But all that was, even though that research is the most prominent, that research is not about D&I at all. That research is about a few very superficial characteristics. True D&I includes things such as this. And finally, the title was The Business Case for Diversity and Inclusion. But do we even need a business case? Right? Can't there just be an ethical and moral case? So even going back to demographic diversity, which I said there's no business case for, one might think, well, there's a moral case just to include underrepresented minorities, be these women or be these ethnic minorities or be these people with a different sexual orientation. Well, that is differences in terms of demographic diversity. Yes, there is not data showing that we can make more money out of doing that, but maybe making more money was not the reason to do this. Maybe we just think it's the right thing to do. We want to have a board or a workforce which reflects the demographic characteristics of the broader population. Now, do not claim that this is something that's going to make us more money, but just do it because we think that it's the right thing to do, but don't misreport the data as some studies have done. Finally, Geoffrey asked me to share some of my own experiences of diversity being a minority in two forms, the most obvious being ethnicity, but the second being age. And this is really important, particularly as a professor or somebody involved in, say, policy, where they do make some inferences according to your age as to how your expertise is. And also in terms of discrimination, it's not that you'll have one particular moment where somebody will act in a very hostile way towards you, but a lot of micro moments. And looking at the research by people who do this, this is what is actually really serious. Small micro moments where there are times where people will just do something to make you a little bit less valued. Yes, so there have been times where at London Business School, senior faculty will call me a Chinaman. They'll say, you get your clothes from China. I've actually was born in the UK. I've been to China twice in my life, but let's put that aside. There have been times where I've seen students abused by saying, go back to China, you're full of coronavirus, and people do things like ching chong, ching chong. That is really bad, right? Nothing happens to those people who, even though I have recordings of such behavior. But I think what is more serious is sort of the micro moments rather than overt cases of racism. My first faculty meeting, the faculty have to sign a register just to show that they attended the meeting. So I was sitting in the row of faculty, the person next to me takes the piece of paper, the sign-up sheet, turns to me, and immediately turns behind and gives it to mine, thinking that I'm clearly somebody who cannot possibly be a faculty member. Maybe I'm there to take away their dry cleaning. So, well, what does this mean? It means that because a lot of this is micro moments, these are not things that you can immediately do in terms of reporting them in an easy way. So clearly, if there's a clear case of harassment, that might be something you can trigger something. But with these micro moments, if I was to say, well, this one particular time where the person did not give me the sign-up sheet, then I'd be seen as being a troublemaker, and quite rightly so. But it must be that within these organizations, there should be ways of people who face repeated discrimination in a way of death by 1,000 cuts should feel the opportunity to do that. Because if they don't, then I think you can have a huge lot of human capital, and this can be overshadowed by some superficial effort. When the true assessment of diversity and inclusion is from talking to people, trying to figure out these micro moments of discrimination. That's what's done in surveys such as this. There's other data sources such as the Glassdoor website, but in order to evaluate whether a company is doing well, don't think at, oh, did you put a black square during the issues with Black Lives Matter, or do you give a lot of money to charity, or even how many minorities you're on the board. That's something you can easily deal with, even if you're not truly addressing the issue. But let's get to the grassroots, let's have boots on the ground as to how employees are actually being treated.